If someone offered you their very last dollar just to listen, would you stop, or would you keep walking? Most people assumed the little girl standing beneath the old maple tree was asking strangers for money. They hurried past with steaming coffee cups in their hands, eyes fixed on glowing phone screens, briefcases swinging beside pressed suits, never slowing long enough to notice the worn violin tucked beneath her chin. She didn't call after anyone. She didn't beg. She simply waited. The crisp October air drifted through downtown Boston, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street cart while golden leaves skipped across the brick sidewalk. Cars rolled past in steady lines, their engines humming beneath the distant church bells announcing another ordinary Thursday afternoon. Then a black luxury sedan eased to the curb. The driver stepped out first, opening the rear door as though the city itself should pause. Christian Hayes emerged without looking up. At 42, he was the kind of CEO whose schedule was measured in minutes worth millions of dollars. Every movement was deliberate. Every conversation had a purpose. Every decision had a price. Reporters called him brilliant. Investors called him fearless. Employees called him demanding. The truth was simpler. Christian Hayes had forgotten how to stop for anything that couldn't be measured on a quarterly report. His silver watch vibrated gently with another reminder. Board meeting in 18 minutes. Conference call in 36. Dinner with international investors at 7 sharp. Every hour already belonged to someone else. As he adjusted the cuff of his charcoal overcoat and started toward the towering glass headquarters of Hayes Global Technologies, he heard the faint sound of violin strings floating above the noise of traffic. Soft. Careful. Almost fragile. He barely noticed. Until the music suddenly stopped. "Sir," a young voice called. Christian slowed just enough to glance over his shoulder. A little girl, perhaps 8 years old, stood beside an old violin case resting on the sidewalk. Her blonde hair was gathered into a loose braid that had begun slipping apart in the autumn breeze. Her navy sweater had been mended neatly at one elbow, and her sneakers carried the honest wear of countless walks across city blocks. Yet despite everything about her appearance suggesting hardship, her blue eyes held something entirely unexpected. Confidence. She walked toward him with small, steady steps and reached into the pocket of her sweater. Christian expected a request for spare change. Instead, she unfolded a single crisp $1 bill and held it out with both hands. "I'll give you this," she said with complete sincerity, "if you'll stay long enough to hear one song." For the first time in years, Christian Hayes simply stared. Around them, pedestrians continued flowing like a river that refused to notice either of them. Someone laughed across the street. A bus hissed to a stop. A pigeon fluttered onto a nearby bench. Yet somehow the entire city seemed to grow quieter. Christian looked down at the dollar bill, then back at the little girl. "You want to pay me?" he asked, unable to hide the disbelief in his voice. She nodded once. "Because your time is probably expensive." The words landed harder than any negotiation he'd faced inside a boardroom. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that before. Not with admiration. Not with fear. Simply with quiet honesty. The little girl smiled gently, extending the dollar another inch closer. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. "And I only need 4 minutes." Without realizing it, Christian's hand slowly reached forward. Christian did not realize he had taken the dollar until he felt the crisp edge of the bill resting between his fingers. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow it felt heavier than every contract waiting inside his leather briefcase. Emily smiled, stepped back toward the weathered violin case, and carefully lifted the instrument into place beneath her chin. There was nothing remarkable about the violin itself. Its varnish had faded with time, tiny scratches traced its wooden surface, and one corner had clearly been repaired by patient hands rather than expensive craftsmen. But she handled it with the kind of respect most people reserved for family heirlooms. Christian glanced. instinctively at his watch. 4 minutes. He could spare 4 minutes. Or at least that was what he told himself. His driver stood several yards away, confused but silent, while Christian remained on the sidewalk instead of entering the gleaming office tower behind him. The city continued moving around them with practiced urgency. Delivery trucks unloaded fresh produce for nearby restaurants. Cyclists slipped between lanes of traffic. Office workers hurried toward afternoon meetings with paper cups balanced carefully in one hand. Nobody seemed interested in the little performance about to begin. Emily closed her eyes for just a heartbeat, took one slow breath, and drew the bow across the strings. The first note floated into the autumn air with astonishing gentleness. It was neither loud nor dramatic. It simply existed, warm enough to soften the edges of the bustling street. Christian expected the uneven sound of a child still learning. Instead, every note carried quiet confidence. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was telling a story without speaking a single word. Another note followed, then another, weaving together into a melody that somehow made the city seem farther away. Christian found himself lowering his phone without even noticing. The reminder for his board meeting flashed across the screen before fading unanswered. He did not dismiss it. He simply forgot it was there. Something unexpected happened as the music continued. His shoulders relaxed. The familiar tension that usually settled across his neck during every business day slowly disappeared. It had been years since silence inside his mind had lasted more than a few seconds. Yet now the endless calculations, forecasts, negotiations, and deadlines seemed to drift somewhere beyond the reach of the violin. A young couple slowed their pace. An elderly man carrying groceries stopped beside a newspaper stand. A mother pushing a stroller quietly moved closer, smiling as her toddler swayed gently with the melody. One by one, strangers who had been racing through another ordinary afternoon found themselves standing together without anyone asking them to stay. Emily never looked up. She played for the music itself, not for applause. Christian noticed the nearly empty violin case resting open on the sidewalk. Inside lay only a handful of dollar bills, several quarters, and a folded piece of blue paper tucked carefully beneath the lining. There was no handwritten sign asking for help. No explanation. No request for donations. Just enough space for people who wanted to listen. Christian suddenly understood something that unsettled him more than any difficult negotiation ever had. Emily had never offered him that dollar because she believed he needed money. She had offered it because she believed his attention deserved respect. In her world, listening was valuable enough to be paid for. The realization settled quietly inside him as the final note lingered in the cool afternoon air, hanging above the street for one beautiful moment before fading into the sound of rustling leaves. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The small crowd that had gathered answered the final note with quiet smiles instead of applause, almost as if clapping might disturb something too beautiful to interrupt. Emily lowered the violin carefully, polishing one fingerprint from the worn wood with the sleeve of her sweater before placing the instrument gently back inside its old case. She looked up at Christian with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. There was no expectation in her eyes. No hope that he would offer more money. No rehearsed speech waiting to persuade him. She simply extended her hand. "May I have my dollar back now?" she asked with a polite smile. Christian blinked. "You want it back?" She nodded. "You listened for the whole song." He looked down at the crisp bill still resting between his fingers. Somehow, during the music, he had completely forgotten he was holding it. "I thought you were giving it to me," he admitted. Emily laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded genuine because it carried no judgment. "It was only a deposit," she said. "I wanted to make sure you stayed until the end." Several people nearby chuckled quietly, but Christian found himself smiling instead of feeling embarrassed. It surprised him how natural the smile felt. He could not remember the last time one had appeared without being requested by photographers or business magazines. He handed the dollar back. Emily folded it neatly and slipped it into a tiny envelope inside her violin case with obvious care. Christian noticed there were several identical envelopes arranged in careful rows. Each carried a handwritten date. "You keep them separate?" he asked. Emily nodded proudly. "Every dollar has a job." Christian tilted his head. "A job?" She crouched beside the case and pointed one finger toward the small envelopes. "This one is for violin strings. This one is for bus fare. This one is for groceries." Then she gently touched the envelope holding the dollar she had just reclaimed. "And this one is for something important that I am still saving for." Christian studied the little collection far longer than he expected. In his world, money existed inside spreadsheets, investment portfolios, and international transfers involving numbers too large to picture. Yet here, every single dollar had a name before it had a purpose. Every bill represented intention instead of accumulation. Emily closed the violin case and fastened the silver latches. "People think rich means having a lot," she said quietly while adjusting the strap over her shoulder. "But I think rich means knowing exactly where what you have should go." Christian stared at her. It was such an ordinary sentence, spoken without trying to sound wise, yet it landed with uncomfortable precision. His entire career had been built on making money move faster than anyone else could imagine. Companies. Stocks. Markets. Acquisitions. Growth. More. Always more. Yet when was the last time he had stopped to ask where enough actually was? His phone vibrated again. Another reminder. Another meeting already beginning without him. He reached into his pocket almost automatically, then paused before turning the device completely off. The black screen reflected his own face for a brief moment, and somehow he looked older than he had an hour earlier. Not because of exhaustion, but because he suddenly recognized how long it had been since anyone had challenged him without wanting something in return. Emily lifted the violin case onto her shoulder and offered him a warm smile. "Thank you for listening, Mr. Hayes. Most people only hear the beginning before they decide they are too busy." Then, without asking for a photograph, a business card, or another minute of his time, she turned and began walking slowly down the sidewalk, leaving Christian standing beneath the maple tree with a silence inside him that no quarterly report could ever explain. Christian watched until Emily disappeared into the flow of afternoon pedestrians, yet something refused to let him step inside the glass tower waiting behind him. For years, every day had followed the same precise rhythm. Meetings began exactly on time. Decisions were measured by profit. Success was summarized inside charts that climbed steadily upward. His life had become so predictable that even the surprises arrived according to schedule. But today, one little girl carrying an old violin had quietly unsettled a system he had spent 2 decades building. His driver approached carefully. "Sir, the board has already gathered upstairs." Christian remained still beneath the maple tree. "Tell them I will be late." The driver hesitated. During 8 years of working together, he had never heard those words. "How late, sir?" Christian looked down the sidewalk where Emily had vanished. "I do not know." The answer surprised even him. He slipped both hands into the pockets of his overcoat and began walking in the opposite direction from his office. No destination. No appointment. Just footsteps moving through streets he usually observed only through tinted windows. The city looked strangely different at walking speed. A florist carefully arranged bright chrysanthemums outside a small shop. 2 construction workers shared coffee beside a pickup truck, laughing at a joke only they understood. An elderly woman paused to admire pumpkins displayed outside a neighborhood grocery store. Christian realized he had spent years flying above ordinary life without ever landing inside it. Nearly 3 blocks later, he heard the familiar sound of violin strings once again. The melody drifted from a small neighborhood park tucked between brick apartment buildings. Emily stood beside an old wooden bench, playing for half a dozen people scattered across the grass. A young father bounced his toddler gently to the rhythm. 2 college students listened while sharing sandwiches. An elderly couple sat hand in hand without speaking. Nobody seemed concerned about time. Nobody looked at a watch. Christian stopped beneath an oak tree where Emily could not easily see him. He wanted to understand something that had been bothering him ever since she mentioned every dollar having a job. When the song ended, one little boy wearing a baseball cap walked over carrying 2 chocolate chip cookies wrapped inside a napkin. "My grandma made these," he said shyly. "One is for you." Emily accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. Then, instead of eating both cookies herself, she broke one in half and handed the larger piece back to the boy. "Thank you for listening," she said. "Music always tastes better when somebody shares dessert." The little boy laughed before running back to his grandmother. Christian could not explain why such a simple exchange lingered in his mind longer than billion-dollar negotiations ever had. Nothing had been bought. Nothing had been sold. Yet somehow everyone walked away feeling richer. Emily finally noticed him standing beneath the tree. She smiled exactly as she had earlier, neither surprised nor nervous. "Hello again, Mr. Hayes." Christian stepped closer. "You moved." She nodded. "Different places hear music differently." He looked around the quiet park. "And this place?" Emily rested one hand on the violin case. "People here stay longer." Christian almost asked another businesslike question, but stopped himself. Instead, he found a different one emerging almost on its own. "Who taught you to play like that?" Emily's smile softened. She looked down at the old violin before answering. "My dad did. He always said that if one person truly listens with their whole heart, then the music has already done everything it was meant to do." Christian felt something shift quietly inside him. He had spent a lifetime filling conference rooms with hundreds of voices, yet he could not remember the last conversation that had reached him as deeply as the gentle words of an 8-year-old standing beside an old wooden bench with a weathered violin. Emily lowered herself onto the old wooden bench, resting the violin case beside her as the late afternoon sun slipped through the orange leaves overhead. Christian remained standing for a moment before quietly sitting at the opposite end of the bench, leaving enough space to avoid making the little girl uncomfortable. Neither of them spoke immediately. The park settled into that peaceful silence that only arrived between the laughter of children and the evening rush home. Somewhere nearby, a fountain splashed steadily while squirrels darted across the grass collecting acorns before winter arrived. Emily carefully opened the violin case once more. Christian noticed that she was not reaching for the instrument. Instead, she gently lifted the folded blue paper he had seen earlier beneath the lining. She unfolded it with remarkable care, smoothing every crease before looking at it for a long moment. "Is that your music?" Christian asked softly. Emily smiled and shook her head. "Not exactly." She turned the paper toward him. It was an old photograph, slightly faded around the edges. In it stood a younger man holding the very same violin while a much smaller Emily laughed beside him, her tiny hands trying to copy his posture. Autumn leaves filled the background exactly as they did today. "That is my dad," she said quietly. Christian studied the photograph. The man's smile looked effortless, the kind that came from someone who measured success very differently than quarterly earnings. "He taught you everything?" Emily nodded. "Every Saturday morning." Her eyes remained on the picture. "He used to tell me that every song is really a conversation. If people only hear the notes, then they miss the person playing them." Christian found himself looking from the photograph to the little violin resting beside her. Suddenly the instrument no longer looked worn. It looked loved. "Where is your father now?" he asked gently. Emily folded the photograph again before placing it safely inside its envelope. She answered without sadness, only quiet acceptance. He passed away 2 years ago after being sick for a long time. Christian lowered his eyes. I am sorry. Emily offered a small smile. He told me not to stay sad forever because music cannot grow inside a heart that stays closed. She tapped the violin case lightly. So I keep playing. Christian felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He remembered standing beside his own mother's piano many years earlier while she practiced during quiet Sunday afternoons. He had not thought about those memories in decades. After she passed away, the piano had been sold before he left for college. He had convinced himself that forgetting was easier than remembering. Yet now, listening to Emily, forgotten pieces of his own childhood quietly returned. Did your father leave you anything else? Christian asked. Emily nodded toward the tiny envelopes arranged inside the violin case. Just advice. She smiled. He always said that money should never tell your heart where to go. Your heart should tell your money where it belongs. Christian sat perfectly still. Those words echoed almost exactly what she had said earlier about every dollar having a job. For the first time, he understood they were never simply clever ideas from a thoughtful child. They were lessons passed from one generation to another, carried forward every time Emily lifted her violin. She looked up at him with sincere curiosity. Did somebody ever teach you something that you almost forgot? Christian opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, he stared across the quiet park as memories he had buried beneath years of ambition slowly began finding their way back, carried not by business success, but by the gentle wisdom of an 8-year-old girl who believed every melody deserved at least one person willing to truly listen. The following afternoon, Christian left his office 15 minutes earlier than anyone expected. His assistant looked up from her desk, surprised to see him carrying nothing except his coat. There was no laptop tucked beneath his arm, no folder filled with reports, no phone pressed against his ear. The unanswered questions from executives could wait until tomorrow. For reasons he could not fully explain, there was somewhere else he wanted to be. When he reached the neighborhood park, Emily was already there, tightening the bow on her violin with careful hands. The old wooden bench beneath the oak tree remained empty, as though it had quietly reserved a place for him. She looked up, smiled, and waved. You came back. Christian returned the smile before sitting down. I suppose I did. Emily nodded as though she had expected nothing less. Good. I was hoping you would hear the second half. Christian laughed softly. The second half of what? She gently tapped the side of her violin. The conversation. Before he could ask another question, she lifted the instrument beneath her chin and began to play. The melody was different from the day before. Lighter. Brighter. It danced through the cool autumn air like sunlight slipping across the surface of a quiet lake. Christian watched people slow their hurried pace once again. A mail carrier paused beside the path. A teenager removed one earbud and stayed longer than he intended. Even a jogger stopped to stretch near the fountain simply to listen. Nobody seemed to realize they had become part of the same invisible audience. When the song ended, Emily carefully returned the violin to its case. Christian reached into his wallet, but before he could remove any money, Emily gently shook her head. Not today. He looked puzzled. Why not? She smiled. You already paid yesterday. Christian frowned slightly. I did not pay anything. Emily laughed. Yes, you did. You gave me 4 minutes that you could never get back. That was worth much more. Christian slowly closed his wallet. He had spent years believing that time became valuable only when converted into productivity. Yet sitting on that bench, he realized those quiet minutes had produced something no investment strategy ever had. Peace. Emily reached into a paper bag resting beside the bench and pulled out 2 small cups of hot cocoa with colorful paper lids. She offered one to him. I brought extra today. Christian accepted it with genuine gratitude. The warmth spread through his hands while the sweet scent of chocolate drifted into the cool afternoon air. Do you always carry hot cocoa? He asked with a smile. Emily shrugged. Only when I think someone might need it. They sat together without speaking for several moments. Christian watched a group of children chase bright leaves across the grass while Emily quietly sipped her drink. It felt strangely comfortable. There was no pressure to impress each other. No negotiation hiding beneath the conversation. Finally, Emily looked toward him with her usual thoughtful expression. Can I ask you something? Christian nodded. Of course. She tilted her head slightly. Did you smile today before you came here? The question caught him completely off guard. He searched his memory. Meetings. Emails. Financial forecasts. Elevator rides. Conversations with investors. He could not remember smiling even once. Slowly, he shook his head. Emily did not criticize him. She simply smiled a little wider herself. That is okay, she said gently. You smiled twice while listening to the music. Tomorrow, maybe you will smile 3 times. Christian looked down at the cup warming his hands and quietly laughed. For the first time in many years, someone was not measuring his success by how much he earned, how many companies he owned, or how many people answered to him. An 8-year-old girl with a weathered violin and 2 cups of hot cocoa was measuring his progress by something far simpler. Whether his heart remembered how to smile. The next afternoon, the old wooden bench beneath the oak tree remained empty. Christian arrived 5 minutes early without realizing he had begun measuring his days by Emily's music instead of board meetings. He looked toward the maple-lined path where she usually appeared carrying the weathered violin case, but only drifting leaves greeted him. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The familiar melody never came. For reasons he could not explain, disappointment settled quietly over him. He waited another 15 minutes before finally standing. As he turned to leave, he noticed the elderly groundskeeper sweeping leaves near the fountain. Excuse me, Christian asked politely. Have you seen the little violin player today? The man nodded slowly. Emily? Christian was surprised the groundskeeper knew her name. She plays here almost every afternoon, the man said. Sweet kid. She stopped by this morning, but she did not stay. Christian felt an unexpected knot tighten in his chest. Did she say why? The groundskeeper rested both hands on the broom handle. She mentioned she needed to visit her mother instead. Christian thanked him and started walking away before stopping again. Do you know where? The old man pointed toward a modest neighborhood several blocks away. A small apartment on Hawthorne Street. She never complains, but everybody around here knows she has been carrying a lot for someone so young. Christian walked there without calling his driver. The streets gradually changed from polished office buildings to rows of aging brick apartments decorated with flower boxes and bicycles resting beside narrow porches. It was a neighborhood filled with people who greeted one another by name. Outside one small grocery store, he recognized the owner from the park. The woman smiled warmly when he mentioned Emily. She came by this morning, she said while arranging fresh apples. She asked whether anyone wanted to buy homemade cookies this weekend. Christian looked surprised. She sells cookies too? The woman nodded gently. Only when she has to. Those 4 words stayed with him as he continued toward Hawthorne Street. A few houses later, he noticed something familiar in the window of a neighborhood music shop. Resting behind the glass was a handwritten card attached to an empty display stand. Reserved for appraisal. Beside it stood an elderly shop owner carefully polishing another violin. Christian stepped inside. The warm scent of cedar and polished wood filled the quiet room. May I help you? The owner asked kindly. Christian hesitated before answering. A little girl named Emily Carter. Has she been here? The old man sighed softly. Yes. Yesterday. Christian's heart sank. Was something wrong with her violin? The owner shook his head. Nothing that could not be repaired. He paused before continuing. She asked me how much it might be worth if she ever decided to sell it. Christian stared at the empty display stand. Did she? I told her the violin was old. The shop owner smiled gently. But some things become priceless because of who loved them first. Christian immediately remembered the faded photograph inside the blue envelope. Emily's father. Saturday mornings. Every song is a conversation. The tiny envelopes with names written on them. Every dollar has a job. The old man continued quietly. She thanked me, smiled just as she always does, and said she hoped she would not have to come back. Christian looked through the front window toward the quiet street outside. For the first time since meeting Emily, he understood that something much larger than music was unfolding. She was preparing to let go of the one gift that still connected her to her father. And somehow, he knew with complete certainty that this was no longer a problem he could solve simply by handing someone a check. If he truly wanted to honor everything Emily had taught him, he would first have to understand what she was trying so hard to protect. The following morning, Christian arrived on Hawthorne Street carrying nothing in his hands. No expensive gifts. No legal documents. No carefully prepared solution. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, he understood that showing up mattered more than fixing everything immediately. Emily was sitting on the front steps of the modest brick apartment building with the violin case resting across her knees. She looked up, surprised but genuinely happy to see him. Good morning, Mr. Hayes. Christian smiled warmly. I missed the music yesterday. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment. I know. I am sorry. Christian sat beside her on the steps. The park was very quiet without you. She ran her fingertips gently across the weathered wood of the violin case before answering. Sometimes life gets louder than music. They remained silent for a moment until Christian spoke carefully. I stopped by the music shop. Emily's fingers paused. She did not look frightened. Only thoughtful. Mr. Kaplan talks too much, she whispered with a tiny smile. Christian shook his head. He did not tell me everything. Only enough to know you were thinking about selling your violin. Emily looked down at the silver latches. I hoped I would not have to. Why? She took a slow breath. My mother needs medicine that insurance does not fully cover anymore. I have been saving every dollar for months, but I am still short. Christian listened without interrupting. The violin is the only valuable thing we still have. She smiled softly as she rested one hand across the case. Except it is not really valuable because of money. Christian remembered the old photograph tucked inside the blue envelope. It belonged to your father. Emily nodded. He wanted me to keep playing even after he was gone. She looked toward the quiet street where bright autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk. If I sell it, maybe I can help Mom now. But I would lose every Saturday morning forever. Christian closed his eyes briefly. At that moment he finally understood the real choice Emily had been carrying alone. She was not deciding between a violin and money. She was choosing between holding on to her father's memory and caring for the person she loved most in the present. No child should ever have to make a decision like that. Christian opened his eyes with a quiet certainty he had never felt inside any boardroom. What if there is another way? Emily looked at him curiously. Like what? Christian smiled, but this time it was different from every confident smile he had worn during business negotiations. It carried hope instead of strategy. You once told me music only needs one person willing to listen. Emily nodded. That is what my dad believed. Christian glanced toward the violin case. I think he was right. But I also think he underestimated how many people are waiting to hear your story. Emily tilted her head. My story? Christian nodded. Not because people feel sorry for you. Because your music reminds them of something they forgot. Emily studied his face for several quiet seconds before asking, What are you thinking? Christian looked toward the neighborhood church standing at the end of the block, its old community hall surrounded by maple trees glowing gold beneath the October sky. A gentle idea began taking shape, one that could never be purchased, only shared. I am thinking, he said softly, that maybe it is time your conversation reached more than one listener. For the first time since they met beneath the maple tree downtown, Emily's eyes filled not with worry, but with quiet hope as she slowly rested her hand upon the violin her father had once placed into her small hands, wondering if perhaps its most important song had not been played yet. 1 week later, the old community hall beside the neighborhood church glowed with warm light as families, teachers, neighbors, and complete strangers filled every seat. Nobody had come because a famous musician was performing. They had come because invitations had quietly spread through Boston carrying a simple message from Christian Hayes. Come listen to a conversation worth hearing. There were no expensive decorations. No flashing cameras. No reserved seats for executives. Christian had insisted that everyone enter through the same front door and sit wherever they wished. The stage held only one wooden chair, one music stand, and one weathered violin that reflected the soft amber lights above. Backstage, Emily stood holding the instrument close to her heart. She looked toward Christian, who straightened the collar of his jacket before smiling reassuringly. Are you nervous? He asked. Emily thought for a moment before nodding. A little. Christian smiled. Good. That means it matters. Emily laughed softly. My dad used to say the same thing. A volunteer stepped forward and quietly announced that the audience was ready. Emily took one slow breath and walked onto the stage. The room welcomed her with gentle applause before settling into complete silence. She looked across hundreds of unfamiliar faces, then found Christian sitting quietly in the last row instead of the first. She smiled. She understood immediately. He had not organized this evening so people would watch him helping a little girl. He wanted every eye focused exactly where it belonged. On the music. Emily lifted the violin beneath her chin and began to play. The melody floated through the hall with the same warmth it had carried beneath the maple tree, beside the park bench, and across quiet neighborhood streets. Yet tonight it seemed larger somehow, not because the notes were louder, but because every heart in the room had chosen to listen. Some people closed their eyes. Others reached gently for the hands beside them. Parents smiled at their children. Grandparents quietly wiped away tears they did not try to hide. Christian sat perfectly still, remembering the first dollar Emily had pressed into his hand. Back then he believed she had been asking him to hear a song. Only now did he understand she had really been inviting him to hear life differently. When the final note faded, the audience remained silent for one long beautiful moment before rising together in a standing ovation that seemed to fill every corner of the old hall. Emily bowed shyly, then looked toward the back row. Christian simply placed one hand over his heart. He did not need words. After the concert, neighbors volunteered meals, local musicians offered free lessons, community organizations stepped forward with practical support, and the pharmacy that served Hawthorne Street quietly agreed to help ensure Emily's mother received the medicine she needed. None of it felt like charity. It felt like people answering a conversation they had finally heard. Several years later, visitors entering Christian Hayes' office often noticed an ordinary $1 bill displayed inside a simple wooden frame beside his desk. There was no gold plaque. No explanation. When someone eventually asked why such a successful businessman would frame a single dollar, Christian always smiled before giving the same answer. It is the greatest investment I ever accepted. Then he would glance toward the nearby window where music from a youth concert sometimes drifted across the city. Emily Carter had grown into a gifted violinist who never forgot her father's lessons or the autumn afternoon when one stranger decided to stop walking. Because true wealth had never been measured by how much money a person could keep. It had always been measured by how willing they were to listen when another human heart began to sing.